All right. Hi, my name is Jason McLaughlin. I'm a developer at Direct Employers. Um, we use primarily Django in our day-to-day development, at least the Python team does. Um, we do job search software and job profile management. You can see those. We have a microsite job search platforms on the top level, .jobs top level domain. My.jobs. So this is a job search site built on Django. And we've also got secure.my.jobs, which is where you can, there's some employer outreach tools and job seeker profile tools. But anyways, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that. The goal of this is to kind of give an overview of Django as a web development framework. It's covering a lot of what's covered in the Django tutorial available online. If you were to go through the tutorial yourself, that's kind of a 3 to 8 hour process depending on your level of experience with Python. So the goal here is not that you can follow along or that we're writing all the code live here in 30, 40 minutes. It's that I'm going to give you exposure to some of the things I like about Django, some of the things that it does well, and give you an idea why you might want to look into it for projects in the future, and so you know where to start looking for tutorials and other documentation to really get started with it. All right. So getting set up with Django is pretty easy if you're familiar with Python development. We're going to make by the way, I'm not sure the level of experience we have with Python versus Django. So at any point, if you want to stop and ask questions, feel free. I see this as more of a kind of conversation and discussion about what we're doing here. But we're going to make an example goal tracker app. If I can. So getting started is easy. You just install Django. Okay. Okay. So sorry, I'm kind of working along here. I've got the code in place, so I'm going to pretend to do a lot of commands here. But Django admin start project goal tracker. That gets you a few things right off the bat. Creates a site with some basic settings and a okay, yeah. So you've got a site here. One of the first something got nested funny when I was transferring this over. I'm sorry. Okay, here we are. In every project, there is a URL dispatcher. It lives in urls.py. This is where you just control any HTTP request coming in was going to hit this first. Django is going to take that, look at the incoming path, match it to a regex, and then pass it off to a view. And in this case, it comes pre-configured with the admin view enabled. We'll talk about the admin later. And then the views is where your code lives that pulls data from the models before it sends it off to as a response to the users. Models are your ORM over the database. So it's how you manage your data, actually pull the data out, views arrange the data, they send it to a template, which if you're familiar with the model view controller pattern, that's similar to the view, that's what actually arranges the data and presents it to the user as HTML. Okay. So there isn't too much to see here now. This is just what Django creates by default when you start a project. Within our goal tracker site that we're making here, we're going to create an app called Goals. So that is just a start app goals. And then within that directory, it's going to make a goals app that's got a little more. I'm not going to run that now because I've already run it. So as we go into the goals here, we see that creates a little more than the previous command did. We have our views here, models.
What do you recommend to new people for like when to create an app versus like when to just create more parts inside of an existing app?
Yeah, honestly, the last time I did this, I thought, having the extra app was maybe a little confusing. So I did put the models and the views directly into that original project that got created. So in this case, we have two steps here. So we've got, you can kind of see it as a, this is the root directory that was created when we did the start project. It created the manage.py, which is where you run a lot of your management commands from. I could show you there's actually a lot of commands. There's good, help here as far as what each command does. And then it's got the root, the folder in there called Goal Tracker was also created, and that's got your WSGI file, which is for interfacing with your local web server. That if you're not familiar with WSGI, that's how Python talks to something like Apache or Nginx. URL routing, which is really for routing within your apps, and then settings.py, which is for global settings that are going to be shared among them. But there's, if you know your project is going to be simple, you can just put the models and views directly in here, and you've got one directory deep. The existing tutorials recommend starting a new app anytime you're actually creating models and views.
I noticed you use Django Admin command to generate the new app. You
Yeah.
also use manage, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So I did the. If there are, I believe there are settings you can override in settings.py. So if you've got things you want in common between all your apps, you want to make some changes, the manage.py command will take those into account. But I'm not sure off the top of my head, what settings those are.
Does the framework have like a test web server? You always have to hook into.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can start one that's up.
And we can actually do that now, even with what little we've done here. We'll need to. Since I'm SSHing into my machine here, we have to pass in the IP to make it available. And thank you for that segue. I'm not sure.
Try to find the bar. It's all the way on the right. Yeah, there you go.
Well, it was.
Define Firefox?
I thought I just tabbed over to Safari, but it's not. There we go. Do you have several browser instances open? Oh, we did have it. That's right. I was using Firefox. Excuse me. Okay. So yeah, you start your run server. We've created an empty app, and this is the default view here, just a welcome to Django page. And so yeah, you wouldn't want to use that in production, but it's convenient for development, obviously. And then let's see. So you can see requests coming in here. We have a GET request and received a 200 response. All right, so the okay, yeah. So within our goals app, we're gonna create some basic views and models. The first thing we need to do adding an app is create a homepage. So we added a simple regex that just says, here's the start of the string, here's the end of the string. We actually don't want a path. This is just the default home view. We're going to pass it off to a view. Okay, this is a simple view. So once the URL dispatcher sends the request to the matched view, named index in this case, the view accepts a request object. We can pull whatever data we want from the models, which I'm going to go to in a sec here and show you. Yeah, that might be getting too crowded. So we pull some data and we return a simple string as a response. This is the goals index, and then we actually do pull some dynamic data and load it in there. Stop pressing Alt-Tab sometime before I'm done with the presentation. Okay, so this is our view. Now you'll notice in urls.py I hadn't specified a path, but here we had to go to /goals. That is because in the parent app, a step I forgot to set, we had added the application to urls.py. So this lets you keep your apps separate. You can configure the URLs within each individual app, but then pass them from the top level site. Make sense? Okay.
So these separate apps, are they just like separate folders or different functions?
Yeah, and there's no reason. So if you're in a different app and you want to pull models or refer to views in another app, there's no reason you can't do that. So it's mostly just for organizing your code, testing it. If you want to make them installable on other projects later, it makes it a bit easier to do that. You can enable and disable them as needed in settings
So
here
also,
in the installed apps.
if you can repeat the question for the people who are on the chat.
Oh, yeah, okay. The question was, are the apps just separate folders? What's the purpose of having them as separate apps? And it's mostly just to keep applications with different responsibilities separate. And this here, I actually forgot to mention this, but adding your new application to the installed apps here is a necessary step for it to show up.
There's also a question that we're seeing PYC files in your tree.
Yeah.
And
as far as what they are?
No, the fact that you're seeing PYC versus the kind of from future import, is it a requirement we use Python 2.7, or is this also compatible with Python 3?
Let's see. This is the latest version of Django 1.9, and it should be compatible. Yeah, you don't have to use Python 3. So is that the question? Do they have to? Or
is it a requirement for Python 2.7, or can we use Python 3?
Oh, yeah. You should be able to use Python 3. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. A lot of the Django projects made to work with Django are Python 3 compatible. You have to decide, beforehand whether you're using any projects that are still, on 2.7 or not. Yes, so that if we installed Python 3 into the start project, it would probably not have that import feature command there. Yeah. Good question. Okay, so that's how we set up just a basic, this is pretty much the equivalent of a hello world with a little bit of dynamic data in it. So we're going to move forward here. Okay, let's make our our models a little more complicated here. We're on to. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to show off the Django ad. Okay, we'll show off the Django admin. Looks like on this step I had not yet added the activity, so we'll go back to that later. Admin is considered kind of one of Django's killer features. Anytime you create a model, and you saw how simple it was to define the models, they'll set up your, oh, you know what, I didn't actually talk through. Okay, once we've added our app and models to actually create the database, obviously this is one of the advantages of an ORM and Django is that you don't have to write your own SQL to get some data into a database. Let's go back here so we don't miss anything. Okay, so we make migrations to look at our applications, our models, and say, hey, is anything new? Is anything changed? Do we need to either create some new tables or alter existing tables, remove columns? It detects changes, puts those in your code in your folder named migrations, and then once you've got those,
that's new as of what? 1.8?
Yeah, and so it used to be you had to use a library called South to do this. Right now it's integrated into Django. The guy who wrote South, was working on making it integrated into Django. So it's nice. So here we run the migrations, setting up the admin, and and then it sets up our applications that we made. I did want to show you one thing. All right, so just as an example, this is what the SQL would look like for automatically generated migration. You saw there were about 10 of them that got run for the admin. You can imagine this is a lot cleaner, simpler if you're just wanting to get something quickly up and data into a database. Okay, so let's take a look at the admin. If you just want the default admin functionality, all you really need to do is register the app in the admin. And make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Oh, yeah, you can then manage super users from the command line. Okay, so we've created a user. So this is useful for letting people edit the database. You can basically perform CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete on your database, search through the data without having to use a command line. So at our company, we have member services reps who have limited access to portions of this, and they're able to assist with basic tasks. It's useful if your models aren't too complicated. If you're hitting more than 2 or 3 tables to perform an action, you're probably better off writing custom functionality. But for getting something out the door quickly, it's really nice, and I think it looks pretty good too. So we can actually create a goal. Let's say, and obviously this is kind of a toy site. We're just showing off some of the features here. So let's just say let's do it today. Okay, so we've created something there. Now we can go to our site, and we have one goal created. Any questions about the admin? Or the admin is customizable. You could actually go pretty far down that path. I haven't talked to anyone who's done a ton of admin customization and hasn't kind of regretted it. So like I said, very useful for getting things set up. If you know your actions are going to tie closely to individual tables and maybe a couple foreign keys, many to manys here and there, it's useful. But if you're going to grow past a certain size with the admin and use it day to day, you might want to think twice before you start overriding basic pieces of the admin
Have you been
functionality.
regret when you try to upgrade Django?
Yeah, but if you start writing a lot of custom functionality, you're going to run into things that are not documented when you do your upgrades. And then hand in hand with that, one of the nice things about Django is that if you've got a Python developer who's in web development, they are experienced with Django, but they're not necessarily experienced with your own, custom flavor of the admin forms from 4 versions of Django ago. So it's hard to, find people who can get in there and maintain it. It's a little on the difficult side to test that kind of functionality as well.
Is SQLite always used as the administrative database, or?
No, that's just the default that Django came set up with a couple versions ago. All that stuff in the admin, the URLs and the views I showed you on the initial start project was commented out. So now it makes some default choices for you. Admin's enabled. It uses SQLite by default. But yeah, you can use MySQL or Postgres. Okay, I think I must have added the additional models here. Okay. So here this is not too much different from the models we had earlier. We're just adding an activity model. The main new thing to see here is the foreign key we created here to goal. Django supports one-to-ones, foreign keys, and mini-minis. And those give you access to that data when you're querying it. You can query along the path of connected values, and that's I won't say it's easier to write simple queries in SQL, but the main advantage of ORM is if you've got a query, it's composable, meaning, say, almost every view in your application filters by the active user. You've got that now. Any filters you do, you can take that query set that's already filtered by user and add additional filters without having to look at a SQL statement and decide, I've got selects going here and joins going there. Just nice. Should add the Unicode methods here are just the what gets displayed by default when you're printing an instance of the object from the model. And that's useful in the Django admin if you're doing a list view. Otherwise, it's just going to say this is an activity object, which is not very useful. Okay, and we've also got a few more views to look at here. Mostly we're adding a goal detail, and what we did before was just doing a string that got returned directly in the views. Now we're going to show the template functions a bit. Most views, most of the time, you're going to be using templates, I think, unless you're creating an AJAX view that's just passing back data. So here we've got a return. We're using render, which is a Django shortcut. It takes the request as an argument. You select your template, which lives in this case, it's goals/template/index.html. There's a few folders that Django looks for automatically when you're just saying a template name. Templates is the main one. So it'll look in templates in the root directory and then also the application directories. And then important part of rendering the templates is the context. So here's where you're passing in those values that you pulled dynamically in the view, and you can refer to those in the template then. So you're going to have access to the request, which is actually fairly new with Django 1.9. You still have access to the request by default, and then also any other data you pull. So here we're getting the goals. This object here is called the query set. We import the goal class from models. Object is the query set, and then all is just saying we want all the objects there. It's pretty easy to read. Goal detail is when we're going to the detail page for a single goal. So we're getting another. I want to show that. So we have another view created for that detail page. Apparently the next commit. We'll go ahead and create it now. Oh wait, no. That's not how I want to do it. I'm sorry. That's why we're in the wrong URLs folder. Sorry. There we go. Okay, so we have the original homepage view, and then we've also got a bit more complicated Redux than we did before, but nothing unusual. It's just standard Redux. We do a capture group on an integer. And that's the path. We store that as the value goal ID, and that gets passed as an argument to the view, which we can see over here. We'll use that ID to query the goal object that we're looking for. And then with that goal object, we can get the related activity set. This is not the most efficient way to do it. It's just the simplest for demonstrating here. This is actually going to make 2 database queries because we didn't do what's called a prefetch on the goal. So there are ways you can query your data so that you minimize the number of database queries. And this is actually one of the big gotchas of, well, really anytime you get someone using an ORM for the first time, there's going to be cases where they're iterating through an object like they would in plain Python, and they don't realize that every single iteration of that loop is a database query. So that is something you need to look out for. There are tools that help you look at the number of queries you're making. Django debug toolbar is a good one. You're also able to write tests that assert, we're not going over a certain number of queries, and then obviously performance monitoring tools are something you want to think about. But anyways, this is 2 database queries, which isn't too bad. We return a request similar to the way we did on the home page, except we now have both the goals and the activities. Activities are interesting. So now let's look at templates. Detail is probably the more interesting of the 2. This is about as simple a template as you can get. Here inside these double curly braces is where we use dynamic, where we place the dynamic values. So we've got the goal object, and we've also got access to any attributes on it. Oh yeah, that pink's not the. Didn't come over very well, did it? Okay, yeah. So here we're placing the name of the goal, and then here we're creating a table where we loop through the activities. So this is the other main tag you see for dynamic data is the %. You get more code-like functionality there, and then you can also so you can have for loops and if statements, and you can also put in tags that link back to arbitrary Python code in your application. We're not getting into that too much right now. So here we've got the activity, date, time, this pipe here, and date. Date is a built-in filter that comes with Django. It's got a lot of them. So this just keeps it from displaying a big long UTC date time stamp, and then the description.
Are there options to the filters then, like formatting?
Yeah, we can have it just display the month, year, whatever. It takes the argument. There's something like 20 different arguments you can pass to that one in particular. Yeah.
And that's a server-side loop, right?
Yeah. This is server-side. Yeah.
Is there equivalent magic to kind of do some kind of JavaScript kind of client-side loop in the same format, or do you? Well,
this is the page here. So if you wanted to, drop in some JavaScript, you can. And you can even add dynamic elements into that.
Yeah, I didn't know the template language kind of understood that or not. To server or client side. Versus just.
Standard Django, you want to be able to run server-side JavaScript. Is that what you're asking, or were you saying? So for instance, this date filter that does drop back into a Python function in the Django library and run that.
Right.
Yeah, server side. So if we were to create something in filters.py that said spell my activity backwards, you could do that. It would just drop in. You could pass. It would pass the context. I believe you'd have access to the request now, and any other data you wanted to put in there. You want to be careful about using too many of them because you get them into they're almost like putting a bunch of go-tos in your template if you're not careful with them. Okay. So any questions on how this template? And in general, you want to keep as little in the templates as you need for the anything that actually needs the dynamic data should be what goes in the template. If you can make it a static file, you should. It's going to be more performant. Okay, and let's see what that got us on the front end. First, let's go in the admin. I thought we had activities there before, but we haven't. So let's add a couple activities. Okay, so we're going to say we're making an activity towards our goal of reading 10 books. We read 1. We finished it today and now. So here's where the Django admin, this is all the default functionality. You can change the kind of widgets you use here if you want. So let's go ahead and save it. You know what? We migrated the code forward, but I had started with a fresh database when I did the presentation. So let's do our migrations. Manage. Okay, so it just needs to migrate. Okay, so when we added the activity, we had already made the migrations. They were there in the code base. We just needed to run it on our local database.
And the default Django web server is picking up your code changes.
Yep. So as run server's going, if it detects code changes, it'll restart the server. So that's nice. You don't have to go in there and kill it and restart it every time. Okay. We'll just leave it at that for now. Okay. So here's our beautiful website. It's in desperate need of CSS. If any UX guys back at work saw this, they'd snatch it out of my hands and fix it up real quick. But it's good enough for showing what Django actually does, which is mostly the server side stuff. Any questions on that?
Can you outline again when you need to do the make migration stuff?
Okay, so
what do you do that?
So models are code that describe what the database should look like. So at any point in this here, I can delete the SQLite database, check it out at any step, and say make migrations. What that's going to do is create code, Python code, that lives in migrations and describes the state of the database. And it's also going to look at the existing state of the database itself and decide whether we need to make one migration moving forward, or we need to run all these in succession.
So it looks at what the code and the models that Pyfiles are actually doing, and then it compares it against what's either instantiated in a SQLite database, or if there's nothing, it's like, here's what you need to do to recreate this.
Yeah, usually if there's nothing, it will create a table that keeps track of those as well on the databases side. But if there's nothing created, it's just going to create kind of a snapshot, and it'll call that one migration. So if we deleted the database, moved all the way forward, deleted the migrations directory and ran migrations, it would create one migration that just describes the current state of the database. But as it is now, at each checkout, I've got the existing migrations 1, 2, 3, so it'll look from that final migration where it needs to go to match up the existing database with the models.
It automatically looks at the diff, so it's kind of like, here's the current state of the database, and you've done.
Well, it'll make the next migration based on the way the code is describing it, and then if your database gets out of sync with what the existing steps are, you'll get an error message, and it'll say, now do you want to force some migrations or run some ghost migrations? Here, I guess I can.
It automatically goes to the latest.
Yeah.
And if you specify which step to go to, it would go, okay, return me back to this step or go forward to this step. So right now it's just going to the latest, and he's checking out.
So whenever.
The specific step.
The student goes off.
Yeah. So in every migration, you've got both. I haven't looked. more familiar with South. Okay, so here, yeah, it's saying that this is built assuming that there's an initial setup for the goals app as well as a previous migration before it. This is the operation where we're creating the model. Yeah.
And that dependencies comes from actually a file scan of the migrations directory, or is
Yeah.
this actually
Anytime I ran make migrations in the past when I was at each commit. So yeah, so this doesn't have any dependencies. It was the initial migration. Yeah, in South, it actually each migration contained a full snapshot of the database as well, and so that would be the source of errors.
So, honest assessment, it seems like that can be a little brittle. I mean, in real life,
Well,
you find you have to put the patient up on the table and crack the chest and get in there and see what's going on. Or...
So we have a Django application that's been going about 6 years old now. there are times where people would go in and they'd be making manual changes to either the database or with SQL, and so when you go back or we're changing versions of Django, so when you go back and you try to start at migration 1 and run them through 58, it's going to break somewhere along the way. And so really all you have to do is say, I want to do a migration that syncs it to the current state of the code, but that's going to wipe out your data. So usually you're not going to want to count on going back, a dozen migrations and being able to reverse that. Why there aren't too many cases where you need to do that, and that's probably true of any manual SQL scripts you got. Even if you're doing best practices and you've got your forward and reverse, which is what this is trying to do, there's going to be cases where you can't just expect to run 100 migration skips in a row from the last 5 years and it works out well. Though I will say we've had a lot fewer cases where we've had to fake through migrations the last few years. It generally works pretty well. Yeah.
We have a question from the chat room. So if you're planning to use Postgres and MySQL backend later, is it best to start the project with those rather than SQLite? If you could repeat the question, that'd be great.
Okay, the question was if you're planning on using MySQL and Postgres in the future. Sorry, what was the?
Is it best to start the project with that, or is it okay to start with SQLite?
Yeah, is it best to start with that, or is it okay to start with SQLite? I'd say the real question is how much data are you expecting? Can you throw your data away when you move to the database? Or are you going to have gigabytes, terabytes of data that you need to transfer from one to the other? That's a hassle on its own. Yeah, so really the hard part of that would be the data migration. So setting up the schema for one or the other shouldn't really matter, because like I said, at any time you've got your code, you know what the database wants to look like, you can sync the database to that code without having to run the migrations in order.
And are those migrations then kind of database agnostic? They can run against SQLite or run against...
No.
So
probably. Well, for the most part, they should be. You're going to hit... I've never had to try to do that. I wouldn't want to, because you probably are going to hit weird cases where that does not work. In theory, the commands on the migration system are database agnostic, and they should work regardless of which you're running them on. I wouldn't swear to that. Yeah, well, it's probably just little things like how certain data types are treated in SQLite versus MySQL. It wouldn't even be complicated to just be, oh, I didn't know that about that field type, and now it doesn't work. Okay, so we just went through templates, how we're presenting the database from the model, take it, call it out in the view, and then arrange it in the template before we send the HTML response. Did I actually? Yeah, I did. Okay, I guess we should look at the source here just so we see there's no magic going on. Okay, this is Firefox. This shouldn't be that hard.
What do you want to see?
I'm just trying to right click, honestly.
Tap with 2 fingers.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, so you'll see this is the same as our template looked. It just inserted the dynamic elements, and it's just plain HTML, nothing special when it gets client side. Okay. If you can't tell, Macs aren't my day-to-day devices. Okay. Now this is pretty much the heart of what Django is. You've got your model view templates, and so far what we've shown you, what Django's good at is that if you know what your models look like, it gives you a lot of functionality. If your web page is going to correspond closely to your data, it gives you a lot of tools that automatically take care of things. You saw that in the admin. You can see how just getting the default data in a query set is simple. Sorry, pulling all the data or filtering by specific things is simple. Someone mentioned wanting to learn about forms. Okay, so right now we've got an app that we can't submit any data from, so that's not very useful. We're gonna create some forms. Okay, so we're gonna use a model form, which is kind of if what we're doing matches up closely to the models, is the simplest kind of form we can make. We're just from Django importing forms. We import the activity from models, so we know what we're making a form for. This is an activity form. Extends off the base model form. And really all we have to say is point at the model and say which fields. You can either use an include parameter here to explicitly list the fields you want to do, or an exclude if you want to leave some out. Exclude was a little shorter, so I just did that in this case. Okay. Actually, let's show the view. That's a lovely. Okay, so to our goal detail page, we're going to want to insert this form for creating activities directly on that, because that goal detail page has our list of related activities. So this is what we've added here is a check on request. We'll see if the method is a post, and we're going to create a form in that case based on the post data that we pass in. Django does a validation automatically based on the fields in the form, so it's got default values for all those. We're going to get the activity object. Now here, this part's a little trickier. Commit equals false, so we're not committing it to the database yet. We need to pull some data before we do that. We excluded a couple fields, so we need to make sure that those have data. We're going to put in a default value of the current date time for that field. And this is just if you want to do it server side. Obviously, if you had a nice date JavaScript widget and you wanted to send in what you know is valid data from there, you can do that. We set the goal to the current goal, which we queried up at the top of the view here, and then we save it. So now we've got an activity that should be associated with the goal from the detail page, and we're going to redirect back to that detail page. And so we should see the new activity that got saved. Otherwise, all we're doing is creating a form to pass out into the context, and you'll see where we use that later. So this form equals activity form here gets sent out. In the last line here, this was just the goal on activities before. Now we're also passing out an activity form. Let's see how we use that in the templates. Okay. So really just at the bottom here, we're putting an add activity header, creating a form.
Is it possible to change your color scheme on your...
Well, I'm not sure what's gonna... Let's just a plain simple... Ooh, oh, that's much worse. I know what I'm using now. I think we're probably 256 versus not, so I'm not sure. What's everyone's favorite color scheme?
Molokai? Molokai or
I don't even know how to spell that. Is that right?
MOLOKAI.
No, don't have it. Sorry.
Let's try dark.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay, if I spelled it right. Okay. There we go. Okay. So we drop in the CSRF token, so it actually takes our, but that's just handled automatically. They should already have the cookie when they're visiting this page. I didn't really mention it, but there's middleware that all these requests get passed through before they hit the views. Django comes with a handful of default middleware that does useful things like that. And you can add your own. So anyways, this is the activity form that we passed. This must have been a commit between bugs here. So does anyone see what I did wrong here? Grabbing the activity form. Oh, no, I did it right. Sorry. Oh, no, I didn't. Oh, no, I did. Okay, sorry. I called it activity form, which is correct. Yeah. All right, so we drop in the activity form, submit button, and that should just work.
So the column
Even if you forget to close the form.
That actually renders the HTML into the between, basically.
Yeah, so it's this should work even though I forgot to close my form. There we go. There, simple. Okay, so that's how you would make a simple model form.
In order to style that form to make it prettier, does Django Forms library have things built in it? I thought I saw something called widgets or something.
Yeah.
You have greater control over the layout.
Yeah. So there.
So you repeat the question, please.
Oh yeah. Okay. So the question was, what does Django Forms have as far as making this look nicer? So the goal of this was to show the simplest default way we could do. So I had a default settings for model form. Yeah, there are. Within forms, there are better looking widgets you can do for this kind of thing, but really the key, to making this look nice is going to be your CSS that you use, and you can tag these with whatever IDs and divide them up so that you can make it look good.
In order to do that, you would have to view the source, because in the template you just have the form variable, if you will, in the template, right?
Oh, right.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah. So
HTML form layout.
Okay, I get what you're saying. You'd probably want to, and you're probably going to get out of my expertise pretty quick going into design and how you'd want to best do it. A lot of the times, I think our forms are in their own divs, and we set up the styling for that as it is. There, whether you can drop certain IDs or styling into the forms. I think there are some options, but it's going to be fairly rudimentary.
In the I think it was models.py, there's the is valid. Is that just an overall? That's not a field validator calling them all on.
Yep. So when you pass in the post data to the. Okay. Yeah. The question was what the whether what the is valid operator here in the view was doing, whether it's actually going through each field in the form and validating it, and the answer is yeah, that is basically what it's doing. Every form has a method that goes through and validates for each field, and each field has a default way that it takes the data being passed in and checks if it's valid. If it's not, it's going to pass back errors that you can present to the user.
You can override the validator, so you can see.
Yes. Yeah, you can. There's clean methods that pre-process the data, and valid will actually make sure that it's getting into the. But the errors that are a little harder to catch are when they actually hit the database. But yeah, the data is clean and then validated to make sure that it should be okay. So you're not going to catch things like necessarily like integrity errors, like you're trying to assign the foreign key to. Right. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on the model forms? Okay. All right, and the last thing I wanted to present is tests, or our tests. Tests, they behave a lot of the same way that standard tests do in Python, but Django gives you some nice features that would be, if not difficult, it's convenient to use their test cases and clients for testing things like models and views, and template rendering for that matter. So every unit test in Python has a setup method. Django is going to do a few things for you. First of all, anytime you run the test, it's going to automatically create a test database. It's just your standard database name with test underscore before it. This just makes it harder for developers to shoot themselves in the foot by accidentally deleting production data. You shouldn't even really be running tests on the same database that the same database instance that your production data is on, but just in case, it makes it, yeah. So it basically creates a throwaway database. Every setup is going to create that database. You can create your own setup method to add data to it, which is what we're doing here. And then tear down is going to clear out that database. So every test has a fresh copy of the database to work with. That's convenient. It's good for testing data. You can set up data-driven websites if you want to set up a view and check that certain things are where they belong, but not have to worry about deleting, adding, removing, changing the data. That's convenient. The downside is that after you get to a certain size, that can be slow. You want to look at ways to keep tests out of the database if at all possible. You should be unit testing smaller functions if possible, rather than going end to end on the views. Yeah.
The setup method that we're talking about is what we're going to use a set of variables in for the other tests.
Well, really, you can do whatever you want in this setup, but yes, so we've got a class here as a goal test case. Any test defined within this, you call this setup method first. Actually, I should be calling super here because Django, all that nice functionality I just talked about with Django is actually going to be overwritten by what I've got here. So you call super, it does all that stuff, setting up, tearing down the database, and then it runs your own code. And then the other thing it comes with is one that you're going to use a lot is the client, and that's just something that you're able to send HTTP requests to your test server during tests. So here we're creating a goal instance. This is just what it looks like creating a row in the database. You create an instance of your model class, pass in the values, save it, activity, similar, save. And the only thing probably worth noting is that we're actually passing the goal instance to the activity. The reason we call save first is that you need the database key to create the foreign key, so you'll get an error if you don't actually have it existing in the database and you try to create a foreign key. Okay, so test goal index, we grab goal, we make sure that we get a 200, and that and so you also get in the response object, in addition to the HTML, you get the context that was used to render the template. And so this is useful for testing the views specifically. If you don't necessarily want to be asserting that HTML looks a certain way, you're concerned about the data. It's very useful for testing your views. Okay, and then this one is more of a models test. And so here we pull all the goals, and for each goal, we're going to make sure that the number completed is equal to the sum of the activity counts from each goal activity. So I don't know if you saw in the activities, we could say we read 1, 2, 3 books. We want to sum those all up and make sure that that's reflected in the goal model. So we do that. and we get an assertion error, test goal, current value. If anyone was noticing in the goals, I had, you know, counts for the current count on the model, but don't really do anything with that. Here's about in the point where the app restart running. Well, that's probably not a good setup for my models anyways, if that's the data I'm looking to track. But that's not something. So you'd need ways to make sure that that data was being updated when you saved activity if you wanted to architect it that way. That test was actually the last topic I was going to cover. So what we've shown so far, you know, this took, you know, an hour or two to put together. It's a prototype, obviously. So, but it's you can see that if you just want to get some data out there, make web pages that, you know, your designers or front end guys can start working with. It's a good tool for that. And then at this point in the project, you start having things to show. You can decide, well, do we want to, you know, scrap this prototype? Do we want to keep building off of it? And Django is good for both, honestly. The Django is, they have this, you know, motto of batteries included. It's got pretty much anything you think you're going to do with a standard website that, you know, has a database backend that you're getting and retrieving data from. There's some either built-in module that does it, or someone has made a library for it. And not only that, there's a good community around that. You'll be able to find your answer on Stack Overflow at local meetups. You'll know people who are Django developers who can point you in the right direction. And that's really, you know, one of the strengths to it. There's a fairly standard way of doing a lot of web development tasks, and that lets teams work together well.